My name is Emily. I am 34 years old, and I never thought I would find myself wiping the feverish brow of the woman who made my teenage years a living hell. The sterile smell of the hospital bed sitting in her living room was suffocating. Victoria, my stepmother, lay there, frail and broken, a mere shadow of the terrifying figure she used to be. For years, I believed she despised my existence, deliberately pushing me out of my father's life. Yet here I was, feeding her broth and changing her sheets, driven by some inexplicable sense of duty. The tension in the room was always thick, filled with decades of unsaid resentments. But that stormy Tuesday evening, everything shifted. Her brittle hand suddenly grabbed my wrist with a surprising strength, her eyes wide with a frantic mix of fear and regret. She pulled me close, her breath rattling, and whispered, and she could not leave this world without telling me the truth. That night, she unburdened her soul, and her 3 secret confessions made me question every single memory I held dear, completely shattering the reality I thought I knew. Before I dive deep into the specific details of that life-altering night and the heavy secrets Victoria carried for so incredibly long, I want to pause for a quick second and ask you something. From which state or city are you listening to this story right now? I always love knowing how far my personal experiences are reaching and exactly where you all are tuning in from today. Drop your location down in the comments. It really warms my heart to see the wonderful connections we make across the country. Now, to truly understand the heavy, crushing weight of what happened in that dimly lit room, I need to take you back to the very beginning. The deep resentment I harbored did not just magically appear overnight. It was a painfully slow buildup that started the very day my father brought Victoria into our lives. I was exactly 14 years old when my dad, Robert, a 45-year-old architect with a gentle soul, introduced me to Victoria. She was 42 at the time, impeccably dressed, and demanded absolute perfection. My mother had passed away when I was little, and it had always been just my dad and me against the world. But Victoria stepped into our house in Ohio like a strict general taking over a base. Suddenly, my messy room was a severe character flaw, and my loud laughter was deemed highly inappropriate. I tried so hard to win her approval, baking her favorite cookies and keeping my grades up, but nothing was ever enough. The real pain began when she started actively putting a wedge between my father and me. Whenever Dad and I planned our usual Sunday movie marathon, Victoria would suddenly have an urgent dinner party she needed him to host. My dad, who hated conflict, would look at me with apologetic eyes and softly say we would watch our movie next week, but next week rarely came. By the time I was 16, she convinced him to send me to a strict boarding school 3 states away. I felt completely abandoned. I remember sitting on the cold floor of my new dorm room, crying my eyes out while talking on the phone with my best friend, Sarah. Sarah, who is also 34 now and still my absolute rock, listened patiently as I sobbed. I told Sarah that my stepmother wanted me out of the picture to have my dad all to herself. Sarah agreed, telling me to stay strong and focus on my studies so I could get out from under her oppressive thumb forever. I buried myself in my books and my growing passion for baking, determined to prove I did not need their money to succeed. Years slowly passed, and the painful distance between my father and me grew into an impassable chasm. I went to college, got a low-paying job at a local bakery, and barely visited home. Then, when I was 25, I received the devastating phone call that shattered my world. My dad had suffered a massive heart attack and passed away instantly. I rushed back to Ohio for the funeral, my heart heavy with crippling grief and the crushing guilt of our missed years. Victoria stood completely still by the closed casket, wearing an expensive black designer dress, her face entirely unreadable. She did not shed a single visible tear. When his final will was officially read, my worst fears were confirmed. He left the family house and all his physical assets entirely to Victoria. I received a small trust fund, but she walked away with his entire life. I was absolutely furious, but I stubbornly refused to give her the cruel satisfaction of seeing me break down. I aggressively cut ties completely, ignoring all her calls. For 5 brutal years, my routine was unforgiving. I worked the chaotic early morning shift at a busy diner just to pay rent, and then baked custom cakes in my tiny apartment kitchen until midnight, selling them at local farmers markets. I desperately dreamed of opening my own large bakery. Just when I thought I would be hopelessly stuck baking in that tiny apartment forever, a miracle fell right into my lap. An anonymous, wealthy investor, represented by a highly prestigious law firm, reached out and offered me a massive business grant. With that incredible influx of money, I secured a lease downtown, bought industrial ovens, and hired a staff. My bakery, Sweet Roberts, became a massive commercial success. I felt like I had finally won the long war against my painful past. Life was incredibly good and stable. I had a thriving business, a gorgeous apartment, and loyal friends who felt like my real family. I had not spoken a word to Victoria in nearly a decade. I assumed she was living a selfish life of luxury in my childhood home. But then, on a dark, rainy Tuesday afternoon, my cell phone rang. It was a local hospital administrator calling urgently about Victoria. She was 62 years old now, and she had just been admitted through the emergency room with aggressive, late-stage pancreatic cancer. They had searched her belongings and found my cell phone number listed as her primary and only emergency contact. I was completely thrown off balance, in absolute shock. Why was I her emergency contact? Where were all her wealthy, influential friends? I drove straight to the hospital out of sheer curiosity. I fully expected to find her demanding better service, surrounded by people. Instead, I found her completely alone in a dark, sterile room at the end of a quiet hallway. She looked absolutely nothing like the terrifying woman from my youth. She was painfully thin, her skin almost translucent, and her sharp eyes were now hollow. The nurses quietly told me she had no regular visitors and had been handling her brutal chemotherapy entirely alone. A very dark, bitter part of my soul wanted to turn around and let her face the end completely alone. But then I looked at her shaking hands, and my hardened heart unexpectedly broke. I frantically called Sarah from the hallway, stating I was thinking of bringing Victoria home for hospice care. Sarah yelled through the phone, convinced I had lost my mind, reminding me of all the immense pain Victoria caused. I knew Sarah was absolutely right to be fiercely protective of my peace, but I also knew deep down I could not live with my conscience if I abandoned her to die alone. I told Sarah that honoring my father's memory meant not letting his widow pass away in an empty room. It was about the kind of compassionate person I desperately wanted to be. And so I set up a large hospital bed right in the middle of my cozy living room. For the next 2 difficult months, my life became an exhausting blur of strict medication schedules, gentle sponge baths, and sleepless nights. Caring for her was physically exhausting and deeply emotionally draining. Victoria was incredibly difficult, terribly stubborn, and often lashed out in severe pain. There were countless days I sat and cried hysterically on my bathroom floor, wondering why I was torturing myself for this woman. But I never once raised my voice at her. I patiently fed her, carefully cleaned her, and sat quietly reading books aloud. The heavy silence between us was packed tightly with unresolved history. Then came that notoriously stormy Tuesday evening. The rain was violently lashing against the windows, and the house was perfectly quiet except for the hum of the oxygen machine. Victoria had been very restless all day, stubbornly refusing her liquid pain medication. When I leaned in close to adjust her pillows, she suddenly grabbed my wrist. Her grip was terrifyingly strong for someone so fragile. Her sunken eyes locked intensely onto mine, filled with an urgent energy that genuinely scared me. She firmly told me to sit down immediately, stating she absolutely could not hold it in anymore. She said the heavy guilt was choking her much faster than the actual cancer. She demanded that I listen without interrupting. Her voice was a raspy, painful whisper as she made her first shocking confession. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that sending me away to boarding school was never because she hated me or wanted me gone. It was entirely because my beloved father was drowning in a crippling, incredibly dangerous gambling debt that he had expertly hidden from everyone. By the time Victoria married him, violent, dangerous loan sharks were constantly circling our family home. My father was absolutely terrified for my physical safety. Victoria deliberately played the role of the wicked stepmother, insisting I be sent away to a secure facility solely to get me safely out of state. She purposely took all the blame and the hatred, so my perfect, untarnished image of my wonderful father would remain completely intact. My mind went completely blank. A million loud, chaotic questions exploded in my head all at once. Every strange, forgotten memory of my father's nervous pacing in the kitchen, the intimidating men parked in dark cars across our street, his sudden need to work late nights, it all instantly clicked into a horrifying new perspective. I felt a freezing cold chill violently run down my spine, not a chill of anger, but of absolute shock. Was I a complete fool all these years? The deep, burning resentment I had fiercely harbored for over a decade suddenly felt entirely misplaced, incredibly heavy, and deeply confusing. I wanted to scream, to stand up and call her a terrible liar. But looking directly at her tear-streaked face, I knew she was telling the absolute truth. Before I could even begin to verbally process the first massive revelation, she tightened her painful grip on my wrist and delivered her second earth-shattering confession. She stared right at me and asked how I honestly thought a girl with zero collateral managed to get a massive, unconditional business grant from a highly prestigious corporate law firm. My stomach dropped completely to the floor, a wave of nausea hitting me. Victoria confessed, with tears in eyes, that she was the anonymous, wealthy benefactor all along. After my father tragically died, she spent years aggressively paying off his massive debts, quietly selling her own cherished family heirlooms to clear his ruined name. Once the debt was settled, she secretly set up a blind trust specifically for me. She funded Sweet Roberts. She built my entire dream from the ground up. Hot, stinging tears began to stream down my face, falling fast and completely unchecked. I aggressively pulled my hand away from her tight grip and covered my mouth, stifling a loud, heartbreaking sob. The successful bakery, my ultimate pride and joy, my supposed revenge against her cruel existence, was actually her greatest, most selfless gift to me. I had spent years smugly thinking I had conquered the harsh world completely in spite of her, only to brutally realize I had actually done it entirely because of her secret financial backing. She had been living completely alone in that big empty house, eating incredibly cheap meals and denying herself any luxury so she could secretly fund my business. It felt like a physical blow to my chest. Why? Why would she let me hate her for so incredibly long? I choked out that exact question, my voice cracking. Why not tell me the truth? Why let me completely despise you and curse your name for all these years? Victoria gently closed her tired eyes, a single heavy tear escaping down her deeply wrinkled cheek. That brought her directly to her third and absolutely final confession. She slowly pointed a trembling finger toward her small overnight bag in the corner. She told me there was a sealed, unopened letter hidden inside, written by my father the very night before he died. In it, he confessed his severe gambling addiction directly to me, apologizing for his terrible weakness and the massive financial mess he made of our lives. Victoria found it sitting on his desk the morning he passed. She deliberately kept it hidden all these years because she knew if I read it back then, it would permanently, irreversibly destroy my pure love for him. She looked at me with a soft, beautiful tenderness I had never seen before. She whispered that she loved my father so incredibly deeply, and she knew exactly how much I worshipped the very ground he walked on. She could not bear the awful, agonizing thought of me hating him, of his beautiful memory being permanently tainted by his ugly failures. So she consciously, willingly, chose to be the ultimate villain. She chose to carry my deep hatred, to be the daily target of my intense anger, so my father could comfortably remain a spotless, perfect hero in my young heart. She willingly sacrificed our relationship, her reputation, and her own peace of mind entirely out of a fierce, protective, absolutely unconditional love for my father and for me. I stumbled blindly over to the corner bag, my hands shaking violently as I unzipped the main compartment. There, tucked carefully inside a worn family Bible, was a slightly yellowed envelope with my name written in my father's familiar, messy scrawl. I tore it open, and as I read his frantic words, his deep apologies, his desperate shame over the money, my heart broke all over again. He confirmed every single agonizing thing Victoria had just said. He begged for my forgiveness and pleaded with me to be kind to Victoria, explicitly calling her his absolute savior and protector. I sank heavily to the hardwood floor, clutching the letter tightly to my chest, weeping uncontrollably until I couldn't breathe. The sheer, unimaginable magnitude of her grace was completely overwhelming. I crawled back to her bedside, tears completely blinding my vision. I took her frail, freezing hand in both of mine and pressed it hard to my forehead, weeping loudly for the lost years. I looked deep into her tired eyes and told her I was so incredibly sorry. I told her that I completely forgave her, even though she was the one who truly deserved the massive apology. I thanked her for protecting me, for quietly believing in me, and for loving my dad enough to shoulder his massive sins. A gentle, beautiful, peaceful smile slowly spread across her pale face. For the very first time since the day I met her, the heavy, suffocating tension between us vanished completely into thin air. The living room felt incredibly warm, filled with a profound, undeniable sense of grace and true reconciliation. I sat right beside her, holding her hand tightly. I gently stroked her thinning hair and softly hummed my dad's favorite old song. She did not speak another word after that emotionally exhausting night, drifting into a deep, unresponsive sleep. Her breathing grew much slower and shallower over the next few quiet days. I never left her side for a single second. I desperately wanted her to know, in her final earthly moments, that she was truly seen, deeply understood, and loved fiercely by the daughter she never biologically had. Victoria passed away very peacefully on a quiet Sunday morning. I felt the exact moment she quietly slipped away. Her tight grip on my hand gently loosened, and all the deep lines of pain on her face completely disappeared. She looked beautiful, entirely serene, and finally free. I did not feel the frantic, crushing, panic-inducing grief I felt when my father suddenly died. Instead, I felt a deep, quiet sorrow, beautifully mixed with an immense, overflowing gratitude for her existence. I called the hospice nurse to confirm her passing, and then I finally called Sarah. When Sarah arrived, she found me sitting peacefully next to the bed, holding my father's letter, finally at absolute peace with my complicated past. I organized a truly beautiful, respectful funeral for her a week later. I invited the entire staff from my bakery, Sarah, and a few close neighbors who knew her. I confidently stood at the wooden podium and delivered her heartfelt eulogy. I did not speak as a bitter, angry stepdaughter, but as a woman fiercely proud of the brave, selfless mother who raised her from the dark shadows. I told everyone gathered there about her quiet strength and her silent, massive sacrifices. I cleared out my childhood home, keeping the precious photos, and decided to sell the large house. I used the money to start a charity foundation in Victoria's name, providing generous business grants for young women starting their own companies. The burning anger that had heavily fueled me for so long was completely, entirely gone forever. In its place, there was a profound, unshakable sense of purpose and clarity. I realized that unconditional love rarely looks like a perfect cinematic fairy tale. Sometimes it looks like a very harsh, painful decision made solely to protect someone from severe harm. Sometimes it is carrying the heavy, unfair blame so someone else can keep their hero firmly on a pedestal. Victoria taught me the true meaning of sacrifice. She proved that true, quiet strength is doing the exact right thing even when you get absolutely no credit for it, even when it inevitably makes you the hated villain in someone else's story. I go to her quiet grave every single Sunday now, bringing fresh flowers and a large slice of her favorite vanilla cake from the bakery she secretly built. Looking back at everything, I fully realize that stepping right into the fire of my own resentment to care for her was the absolute greatest decision of my entire life. It completely healed a deep wound I did not even know was infected. I learned that you never truly know the heavy, silent battles people are fighting behind closed doors until you sit with them in their darkest moments. Would you have the strength and compassion to care for someone who you believed ruined your life? Until the next story.